The raven came at dusk, slick with rain and travel, its feathers clotted by the salt of a long flight. It clung to the tent rope as if to a branch above a swollen river, blinking black eyes at the firelight that seeped through the seams of the canvas. Catelyn Stark turned at the beat of its wings, a small sound drowned almost at once by wind worrying the guy lines and the hushed grumbling of men over their bowls. Even in rain the camp breathed like a beast, with snorts from hobbled horses and the rustle of spears and the low rise and fall of voices in the dark. She held the letter long after the maester pressed it into her palm, as though warmth might unlock its secrets without the knife. "From White Harbor," the old man said, and pushed his spectacles up the spare ridge of his nose. "From Lord Wyman, and a second, my lady, sealed with a fat man and a fork. 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒐, unless my old eyes lie. 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒐." The word had a taste of spice, of lemon and oil and secrets, of stories Catelyn had been told as a girl and told her children in the nursery at Riverrun, before war taught her how to count men like coins and spend them dear. She slit the first seal with the little knife Robb had carried as a boy, the one she'd kept when he took the sword. Wyman Manderly's hand rolled like the tide. There was talk of ships and grain, talk of the sea wolves' restlessness and the prices set by Braavosi factors, talk that dwelt long on the faithfulness of the Manderlys. More than a man needed, but that was Lord Wyman for you, making pledges out of flesh. At the end he spoke of rumors, set apart with careful ink. Some speak of a silver-haired girl across the narrow sea, he wrote, and 3 small dragons that fly at sunrise. Sailors swear on their mother's milk and on the stranger's own breath, and I put as much weight to such oaths as I ever have. Yet the same tales come in from Old Town, from Volantis and Tyrosh both. If there is aught in this, it may matter to the north. The second letter was shorter. The seal was soft in her hand, the wax pooled like fat, the sigil of a head with curls and a curled mustache cut with care. The words within ran in a clean hand and smelled faintly of a perfume she did not know. 𝒖𝒏𝒊𝒕𝒆 of Pentos, friend to many kings and merchants, sends greeting to Lady Catelyn Tully, mother to King Robb Stark. I beg you forgive the presumption. You have lost and I too have known loss. The world is a wheel. Today it crushes us, tomorrow it raises us. Rumor and truth travel in each other's clothes, and a wise woman unpicks the seams. If it be your sons will to parley with those beyond the narrow waters, there is a ship of my house leaving Braavos for Qarth within a fortnight, and those who bear my token may be received by a listener whose ear is close to the heart of a queen. The token is enclosed. The time for letters is often briefer than the time for swords. There was indeed a token, a coin heavy as gilt, stamped with a fat man's face on one side and a many-towered city on the other. It had been wrapped in silk the color of ochre wine, and even the silk seemed to whisper of another air and of rooms with shutters that kept out the harsh noon. She brought both letters to Robb under a roof of storm. He stood with his palms spread over the map table, hair darkened and wild with rain, gray wind curled at his hip like a shadow. His eyes were his father's when the candles burned low and the talk was of winter supplies and how to carry a war across frozen roads. When she told him what the letters said, he sat very still, as if any movement might scatter the words like smoke, and at last he laughed once, not with mockery but with wonder hollowed by grief. "Dragons," he said, very soft. "Gray wind, did you hear? Dragons." The dire wolf raised his head without stirring the rest of him, and Robb's hand found his ear, stroking, as he stroked maps with the same thoughtfulness. "Do you believe it, mother?" "I know what sailors swear on," Catelyn said. "And what is worth swearing? I know 𝒖𝒏𝒊𝒕𝒆 of old tales. He traffics in men as others in silk. He would sell us to our enemies if it fattened him, but he is too careful to sell US air." Robb stared at the coin a while, then weighed it against his palm, testing its edge as if it were a blade. "If there is such a queen, and if she has dragons, even small ones, the realm will quake. If she turns her face west, every king in the 7 kingdoms must look to his walls. And if she turns her face north?" asked Catelyn. Robb smiled then, the old quick grin that had flashed like sunlight on the tumblestone, and went as quickly. "Then the walls will stand brighter for the light," he said. He was young enough to say it and old enough to hear what hope sounded like in him. We must know if she is true. We must know her mind. The council that night argued like crows on a fresh corpse. Great John Umber smacked his meaty hand on his thigh and shouted for ships. For fetch her, aye, fetch her by the scruff. As if queens could be dragged like badgers from their holes. Roose Bolton hissed through his thin mouth that this was folly and rumor chasing. That the North's rivers ran with Lannister blood already and dragons were a child's game piece. 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 wanted to send men he trusted and keep twice as many close at hand. Catelyn said nothing until the thunder died away to grumble. "Let women go," she said then into the quiet. "Let �𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 and 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆, yes, and a man of sense from White Harbor who has paid 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆 twice and learned to count all the ways they tally your coin. And let them carry not just our words but our terms. If this girl is a queen, she will hear talk of oaths, not flattery. Tell her what your father told me when he took my hand. Robb. He said his house did not kneel easily, but they knew how to stand with those who stood for more than themselves." Roose's eyelids flickered at that, a pale ripple. "That is a pretty speech for a Pentoshi merchant to sell by the ell," he said. Catelyn held his gaze. "Even pretty cloth must be cut to fit," she said. "Better we do the cutting." Robb's hand flattened over the coin. He breathed in the storm air as if to take the rain into his chest. "�𝒑𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 will go," he said, "and 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒏𝒅. I will ask Lord Wyman for a man of his house. They will carry our token and my letter. If there is a queen with dragons, we will know her, and we will know her sooner than our enemies." It was settled. That night Catelyn lay awake listening to rain thrum on canvas and gray wind breathes. She dreamed of a pale girl walking through coals and waking to snow, of a man with hair like black ice who would not turn when she called, and of a coin without faces that spun and never fell. The ships left White Harbor in a clear dawn that broke like glass. The Manderley cog wore a painted merman along her prow and could smell its own fish. The 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆 sailed low and sleek, with a shard of a purple sail and a captain whose laugh never reached his eyes. 𝒔𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆 went armored even on board, the bare island bare upon her cloak, and 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 wore a sword at his hip that had bit deep into the west. With them went Sir Leowyn Manderley, second son to a cousin of Lord Wyman, a man with a neat beard and a way of counting the changes of a man's face as if he were keeping tally. They carried Robb's words. To Daenerys Targaryen, who is said to be queen beyond the narrow waters, Robb wrote, "I do not know if you are true, as men say, or if these words cross to nothing but air. If they reach you, I speak plain. I am the king in the north. I did not take that crown for pride, but because my father died a traitor's death for the crime of keeping his oaths, because the south turns and bites, because my people deserve a shield with a hand attached to it. The north remembers. It remembers your father's fire and the hideous death of mine. It remembers the years of peace under dragons and the years of peace afterward, and knows both were paid for. If you are true, if you are a queen and not a merchant's tale, hear this. I will not bend knee for the sake of bending, but I will bind my strength to one who stands for more than herself, if she will hear the North's demand. We seek our own laws in our own land, and we will fight the Lannisters until they lay down their stolen crowns. We will fight the Iron Men until they crawl back into the sea. Help me make that truth, and I will set my hand in yours before gods and men. I will wed you as my queen if you will have me. But no man's fire will burn the heart of the North again." The sea took them. On its far side the world widened, colors strange and bright, spices in sacks that breathed heat through cloth. In Qarth, the great stone silhouettes of the 13 rose like fingers around a bowl of palaces, and ships that had never seen snow bobbed at anchor. They found no queen there. They found stories of a girl with hair like moonlight who had passed westward in a caravan with 3 small shadows that sang when they were content and shrieked when angered. And men laughed when �𝒑𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 asked where a queen might be found, as if she had asked for a map of a dream. They went on, following tales that grew more coherent as they went, as if rumor itself had learned the way. They reached Astapor with heat pressed into their clothes and grit in their teeth, and a plaza that smelled of salt and old blood, where thin men with whips sold men in ranks by number. The Unsullied stood so still that �𝒑𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 rubbed her eyes and spit. "Their mothers should have held tighter," she said. but her voice was soft with pity behind her scorn. Daenerys Targaryen received them in a merchant's palace stolen from a commissioner who had once counted the coin that bought boys. The room was cool as water, white curtains hanging like cloud bellies, and she sat not on a throne but on a low bench by a window, where the wind could tug her hair. It was true, then. The hair was silver gold, the skin pale not from sickness but from a burnished kind of health, and the eyes of violet that Maester Luwin had called a fancy of women who liked to paint their lovers fiercer than they were. They did not need paint here. One of the dragons slept on a cushion by her feet, a coal-black thing no bigger than a hound's head, its slitted sides rising and falling as if it dreamed. When 𝒔𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 and 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆 came near, it lifted one wing and showed a ribbed translucence like leaves in spring. 𝒖𝒏𝒊𝒕𝒆 Mormont stood behind and to her left in mail and leather darkened by oil, and he went very still when 𝒔𝒊𝒕𝒆's name was given, though his face did not change. His beard had more silver in it than when he had left Bear Island. It lent him nothing he had not already possessed except a weight of years that could be put aside when he smiled. He did not smile. He bowed, and his eyes slid to the token and then to �𝒊𝒕𝒆's eyes with a quickness that said he understood what it meant to bear a northern missive to the daughter of a king whose fire had devoured Starks. "You have come far," Daenerys said, without welcome but without cold. "My hand scalds from men offering it kisses. I do not offer it to those who travel far. I offer it to those who help me do what I mean to do." 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒈 went to one knee, head bowed, and �𝒊𝒕𝒆 only inclined her head as if she were in her own smoky hall. Ser Leowyn held out the letters in both hands, and a boy with one ear took them and passed them to Jorah. The queen's hand was bare. She broke Robb's seal herself and read with her mouth set and then softening and then hardening once more. When she lifted her eyes, they were not child eyes. "Your king speaks as if he knows what a crown is," she said. "Most men say they do. They mean a chair and a sword and the right to put men to death without being cursed for it. He means something else. I do not know yet if what he means is what I mean." �𝒊𝒕𝒆 said, "He means to keep his folk fed and not burned. He means to bring his little brothers home and his little sisters safe. He means to make boys old enough not to die in this war." Daenerys's mouth did something that might have been a smile and might only have been a line with memory in it. "I know something of brothers," she said, "and of homes, and of old men who are boys inside and will never grow. They bargained then, not for coin and men but for time and terms." It was no light thing for a girl raised in exile to bind her fate to a king who had put his father's murder above her father's crown. It was no light thing for a young king who had named himself king in the north to put the north's fate beneath dragon wings. They spoke in the cool room for hours, and when the sun angled lower and grew red through the curtains, Daenerys stood at last and went to the window and looked out at the square. The Unsullied were being driven to water like cattle, which is to say they were being commanded to walk and did not resist. "In this city they remove the buds from the boys," she said, without turning. "They say it makes them suit for killing. The men who do it wear rings carved with the heads of lions and stags and wolves because they fancy themselves lords of a sort. When I leave this place, I will leave it not as I found it." Jorah's mouth moved as if to speak and then stilled at her raised hand. "If I am queen," she went on, "I do not want a north that kneels because it fears my father reborn. I want a north that will keep men like these from doing what they do. Tell your king I will take him at his word and he will take me at mine. I will bind myself to him before gods and men, if he will do the same. But he must hear my terms. The 7 kingdoms were never one kingdom that spoke with one voice. I will not pretend they were. I will not be my father. I will not be a lion in a wolf's skin. The north will keep its laws and its woods and its gods. Its taxes will be agreed between the north and the crown, not set by sour rumors. If we have children, and I think we will, our firstborn, if male, will be heir to the Iron Throne, and our firstborn daughter, if such we have, will be heir to Winterfell if the Starks wish it so. That is how you bind kingdoms rather than merely pile them. I will not put Dragonstone above Winterfell in the hearts of those who call you king. But the Iron Throne will be mine, and the Lannisters will learn again what it means to be answerable." Galbart Glover's eyes shone. �𝒊𝒕𝒆's mouth tightened in something like approval for the first time since she crossed the narrow sea. 𒖏 counted the words as if weighing each one for cheating. He found none. "We will carry this to our king," he said. "And if he is the man we say he is, he will meet you with vows." She tilted her head with that small quickness again. "I mean to free this city first," she said. "I mean to take its whips and give them to the men who were beaten with them. If your king is the man you say he is, he will not mind that I arrive with men who have learned how to stand." Astapor learned. The plaza learned a sound like a sea of soft-footed thunder when the Unsullied marched with spears at the same angle, and the slavers learned what it was to be counted. Daenerys took a whip in her hand and snapped it once, and the dragons answered in laughter, and the Unsullied set their spears in men who had sold boys. Blood ran along the gutters like rainwater in winter, and the city lay on its back panting when she was done. She named a man with a scarred face to command the Unsullied, and he wept and asked to be dismissed from that name. And she said, "Then you shall wear a new one, and it will not be a chain." And he chose Grey Worm, because he said his mother had named him something he could no longer remember, but that had once been a name that meant he had been loved. 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆 and 𝒑𝒐𝒏𝒔 watched dragons grow in the days that followed. The Black One, Drogon she called it, after the only man she had loved as a husband, grew watchful and mean as standing water. The green was sly, the cream and gold was greedy and swift. Յորա watched 𝒑𝒔 as if a man waiting to be caught stealing in his father's hall, and finally caught her alone beside a baked brick pool where fish mouthed at scum. "How goes the north?" he asked without greeting. "How goes my father?" 𝒑𝒔 grunted. "Men die and meat freezes. Your father holds the wall, and if it falls it will not be for lack of his bones holding it up. He is remembered, Յորա Mormont." He breathed out and looked at his hands. "This is a poor road," he said at last. "You took it," she said. He half smiled then, with that bitter light that looks like warmth to those who do not know it. "I did. I will not ask the North to forgive me. I will ask the girl to forgive me, and that will be punishment enough." When their ship sailed with the Unsullied and the freed, now choosing to go on, not ordered, white spray broke like torn silk under the prow. Daenerys stood on the foredeck with her hair bound back and her hand on the rail, and the brazier at the stern flared once as a dragon snorted at its own reflection. She did not look back at Astapor. It was a place she had unmade. It had not been a place for her when she found it. Across the narrow sea the north had not stopped at rumor. Robb met Lord 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆 beneath the Twins where the stones were slick with river spray and old grudges. Walder's mouth sagged as ever, a loose wet thing, but his eyes were sharp as fish bones. He had not forgotten Robb's promise. No man in that tower ever forgot a promise that might yet turn and cut him. "My granddaughter's tears fretted my pillow," Lord 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆 said without greeting, after the rituals and the bread and salt had been done. "My old bones have not much time left to be made a fool. You may be king, boy, but a king who breaks an oath is a naked man in a blizzard. The wind knows what to do with him." "I have never forgotten my word," Robb said. He had Catelyn's voice at his elbow and the Greyjoy's breath at his shoulder and Roose Bolton's eyes like pale knives at his back. "I have asked my uncle Edmure to wed your daughter at once, with all honor and gifts fitting, and I come to tell you I mean to wed too, but I will wed where our war will be won. There is a queen across the sea who means to break the Lannisters' hold as I mean to break it. She will bring dragons. She will bring men who march in a way your men have never seen and break in a way your men have never feared. I will bind her to me, and she will bind herself to the north. And every fry who bears a spear will march beneath a banner that no lion will dare look in the teeth." Lord 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆's jowls worked. "Dragons," he said. "A boy promises me the moon and the wolf's den, and now he promises me fire that was dead before I was born. A boy promises you that the Lannisters will be ash on the wind." The great Jon boomed, but Catelyn's hand stopped him before 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆's prickled rage could rise to appetite. "Lord 𝒊𝒏𝒕𝒆," she said, "we will come through your gate. We will not come like beggars, and we will not come like guests. We will come like allies, or we will come not at all. Look out your window. You see the river? It runs one way, but ice can stop it. You will not send your sons to starve on the far bank for an old promise when a greater one is offered. I have known you since you came late to my father's wedding. You do not lose by bargains. Let us pass with our banners. Give us your daughter and take my brother. When my son is wedded, your halls will hold a queen as kin. When he is crowned, your son will be lord not of crossings alone but of roads. Walder searched her face the way a man tests coin under his teeth. He snorted. You put words on words, Caitlin Tully. That fat Pentoshi should hire you to sing to high as dinners. Words do not turn wheels. The wheels are turning with or without you, Robb said quietly. Turn with them. In the end, Walder took what he had to take, as he had all his life. Edmure Tully married Rosalind Frye with a sweetness that surprised him and no doubt surprised her. There were tears that were not bitterness. Robb's men passed the twins with banners unfurled, and no blood spilled on the salt set out on the high table. The North breathed through the throat of a needle and came out on the far side. And when the men cheered, it was because they were not dead yet, not because the future had grown certain. Tywin will have heard by now, Caitlin said to Robb that night as they rode under a sky that had finished with its rain. He will not forgive a Frye who lets a wolf pass. Tywin forgives when it suits him, Robb said. Walder Frye has made himself suit him many times, and if dragons are on the wind, he will be counting ships. He looked at the coin again in his glove and laughed low without joy. I am counting too. I know how many I have. I do not know how many she brings. He knew after the raven came, the one that found him at Moat Caelin's southern verge, where the neck breathed in the morning like a marsh creature rising to see who had set foot on its back. He had moved south and then north and then south again, a dance forced by blows from the west and from news out of the east. He could have chewed his lip to blood thinking of Theon Greyjoy. He could have strangled grief with his own hands and not lessened it. Winterfell smoked in his dreams some nights and lay clean and white in others. In neither did it feel like ground he could set his feet on. The ravens settled on the horse's withers and stared at him as if judging his kingship. The seal was new, a dragon threefold pressed hard. The hand was hers and it said, I am come. White Harbor saw a sight it had not seen since the conquest. 3 dragons rolled over its masts like storm clouds and shrieked until the gulls went ashore to huddle in the fishmongers' sheds. And men dropped nets and oars in shock as the shadow of wings ran over them. When Daenerys Targaryen came ashore, she came not in silks, but in mail beneath a cloak as light as spiders' work. Her hair was braided in the style of horse lords and city queens both, a language that told of taking and of keeping, and 2 unsullied flanked her with shields that had never known a crest. Beside her walked a man in a bare cloak that had gone from island to desert and back again, and a dark-featured soldier with eyes that measured each soul as if it were a spear length, and a girl who had once been bought like an ornament and now wore a knife because she liked how it felt to own something sharp. Lord Wyman Manderly knelt and still shook like a sail in wind. Tears ran into his beard and he laughed, a great honking sound that set his chins to bobbing, and he kissed Daenerys' hand and then her ringless fingers and then the air around her as if afraid of offending. My lady, my queen, he said. To see dragons in a Manderly sky is to see the world turn. It turns, she said, and her smile lit the mist. I am Daenerys Stormborn, and you are Lord Wyman Manderly. I know you for a man who guards his own. I hope to be one who guards those beyond her own shores. She turned then, and the wind took the edge of her cloak like a thing that had waited for it. Robb met her in the wolf's den beneath a roof of old stone and new banners. He wore no crown at first meeting and she wore none. When he bowed like a lord, not like a supplicant. When she inclined her head, it was as a queen to a king, not as a girl to a man who might be her fate. Robb Stark, she said, I have seen your words. Now I will see you. I have seen your fire, he answered. Now I will see you. Gray wind patted in a slow arc, his nose tasting the scents that clung to her. A sweetness not of perfume but of the oil they rubbed into her dragon scales to keep them smooth, the hint of horse, the breath of brine, and a smoke smell deeper than any hearth. Drogon hissed once and bared the bead-like teeth that were becoming knives beneath her hand, and Daenerys laid her fingers on his neck without looking down. Gray Wind's hackles lifted and lowered like tall grass in a squall, and then he sneezed, which made Lord Wyman laugh all over again, which broke something brittle that had been forming in the room. Your mother is wise, Daenerys said when Catelyn had stood forward and bowed, her face clear of everything but care. "Your letter spoke as a man who knows his people and does not pretend what he wants is what the world needs. That is rare among the men who want crowns. I do not want crowns as much as I want meat salted for winter and boys alive to eat it," Robb said, and she watched him so steadily that it made even the great Jon hold his tongue. "But I know what must be done to have those things." "So do I," she said, and there was a small pain in her voice that did not ask to be looked at. "My father burned the men who might have been his friends. He kept only flatterers and fools and men too frightened to say no. I mean to choose better." She turned her palms up. "Let us choose one another." They spoke in the long hall while the sea muttered itself to sleep against the keys. The terms that had been sketched across a hot room in Astapor were inked and hardened on cold northern air. The north would not bend knee as if bows were all it knew. It would place its hand in hers and she would place hers in its. The gods would witness it, all of them, even those who did not have temples in White Harbor. The first child of their bodies would be heir to the Iron Throne if male and to Winterfell if female. And if there were only one child, that child's fate would be made clear by oaths that entrusted the other inheritance to a named Stark of clear blood and sound mind. The North would levy its own men and tax its own fish. The crown would call upon it in war, and it would answer as a realm bound to another, not as a province shorn of right. "Words that bind," Lord Wyman said reverently when it was spoken aloud. "Words that make the South paler. Tyrion Lannister will understand what this means quicker than the rest," Roose Bolton murmured. "His father will understand it faster still." "Let him," Robb said. "I would rather have my enemies smart and despairing than stupid and hopeful." He did not look at Roose when he said it. He did not have to. The city ate then, as only White Harbor knew how to eat when it had breath to do so. Fish stewed in cream the way old Manderleys had loved it when dragons still lived. Pies crusted with seeds that popped under teeth. Crab from the fingers sent down by boats hastened by rumor. Sauces that melted chill out of the air. Yet for all the merriment, a quiet ran through the feast like a dark rope. Men watched dragons at the far end of the hall, half-crouched like massive cats around the hearth. Dragons watched men with slitted eyes. The merchants who had come for profit came for prayer before the night was out. In corners, oaths were sworn that no man had asked for, as if presence alone demanded a remembering of vows. They were wed on a day the sea had polished itself flat and the sun made a lens of the air. They were wed twice. At dawn, Robb took her hand and led her to the Godswood in White Harbor, a thin shadow of Winterfell's but a true place nonetheless, where an old white were stood with leaves like soaked blood and its face worn away by wind. The Godswood knew him. It took him close when he breathed, as if to smell what he had become. Daenerys stood beneath the pale carved eyes and did not flinch. She had never stood under such a face. She knew other kinds of gods and other kinds of burning. "I do not know the words," she said softly, her breath smoking in the early light. "Then speak what is true," Catelyn said from the foot of the tree, her own voice rough with all the truths she had been forced to live. Daenerys put her hand into Robb's and said, "I will keep his people as I keep my own. I will set my fire to those who mean them harm, and I will not set my fire to them. I will speak truth to him even when it cuts both of us. I will bring him my whole name and take his in turn." She lifted her face to the pale bark. "If there is a god in that wood, let it know I mean this." Robb's voice was rougher. "I will carry her burdens as far as I can, and when I cannot, I will lay them down and we will carry them together," he said. "I will not ask her to kneel when kneeling would make her smaller. I will not be my father's mercy if mercy is foolish, and I will not be my father's wrath if wrath is an excuse to forget myself. I will keep faith. I will keep her." The leaves stirred though no wind moved, and a single red leaf let go and landed on the back of Daenerys' hand, and when she looked down her eyelashes shadowed her cheeks. The second wedding was at midday on the quays, where the sea could be witness, with Unsullied and Northmen and fishwives and sellswords all packed together, a communion of eyes. She walked toward him in a mantle trimmed with direwolf fur and lined within with silk that had belonged to a trader's wife long dead. He wore a cloak lined with cloth of silver sent up from Gulltown by a man who called himself neutral and would not be so forever. The dragons took the air when they said the words, circling once and twice and thrice, and when they stooped, Drogon breathed a little fire that flared and vanished like a kiss. The fishwives shrieked to see it and then shrieked to laugh at their own shrieks. After, in a chamber with a small fire and a window shoved open so the White Harbor could breathe them both, they undid each other's fastenings in a silence that was not fear and not duty. He kissed the whitening line on her shoulder that dragon teeth had almost found once, and she kissed the scar on his arm where a Westerman spear had creased him, and they learned each other's names not as titles but as instruments. There was gentleness and there were teeth. There was the unspoken relief of two lives that had been bent hard finding a shape they could keep without breaking. When they lay tangled afterward, he listened to the harbor and she listened to the wolf's heart, and they laughed suddenly in the same breath at nothing more than being alive. "Tomorrow," she said, "we must speak of Winterfell." He turned his face to hers. "Tomorrow," he said, "Winterfell was more char than clean." Theon Greyjoy had held it only long enough to lose it twice over, once to himself and once to men who wore Bolton pink and pretended they were friends. Smoke-blackened stones showed the old outline of the hall like the shadow of a man who had fallen and yet would not be gone. The gods would smelled of ash and old sap. The heart tree had kept its face. Its eyes looked wet with tears that never fell. They came north through snow that had not yet decided to be winter or autumn's last breath. And with them marched men who had never seen a pine and could not understand why you would burn wood when oil would serve. The unsullied were unbothered by cold in the way men who live in orders of obedience are unbothered by rain. Grey Worm learned to wrap his feet and could scale ice with the same precision he scaled plinths in Astapor. When a hare bolted, he did not know whether to laugh. Bears watched from far-off dark lines in the trees and were unimpressed. Robb would not set Dragonfire to Winterfell. It would be a beautiful, simple thing he knew. A black wing's stoop, a gust of breath, flames sluicing over pink banners until the pink curled black and fell, men in flayed-man livery running for the gates and tripping over each other's shadow. He would not do it. "It must be hours after," he told Daenerys as they looked at the keep from a rise. "You do not make a home by burning it, not if you can help it." "Then I will use my fire sparingly," she said. "I will use it like a knife, not a shovel." He smiled sideways at her. "You mean to carve," he said. Roose Bolton was no fool. He had counted as diligently as Wyman Manderley and with less joy. He had left only a cruel wedge of men at Winterfell and taken the rest with him to do Tywin's errands. In his absence, his bastard held the castle in a way that told the world whose get he was. Ramsay Snow's amusements filled the yards with small horrors, and the men under him stank of the license of such leadership. They were not expecting a queen. They were not expecting dragons. Daenerys sent the green, regal, first, because she had learned he was hungriest earlier in the day and quieter after feeding. He stooped on the flayed man banner and ripped it neat in two with a single rake of his talons, and when the bowmen looked up with mouths open, he washed them in heat that warmed their breath so quickly their lungs forgot to be lungs, and they fell without even time to scream. Protocols were useless when faced with a myth. Yet she did not set the great hall alight. She did as she had promised. She cut. She burned gates and knots of men and left stone to be for later. While Regal made the courtyard an oven, the Unsullied surged for breaches with shields up and spears out, and the Northmen came behind, howling the way Northmen do when they believe they're about to take back something stolen. Robb rode with Grey Wind at his knee and the Great John on his left and Galbart Glover on his right. And the day was a white roar in him that drowned the part that had feared he would never see this place again. Arrows flicked like wasps, and he knocked two aside with his sword without thinking. The third grazed Grey Wind's shoulder and made the direwolf's rage bloom like a footprint in snow. He flung himself up onto the tumbled stones of the gatehouse where the pink paint was blistering, and when his sword came down, it came down on a man who had laughed while boys were flayed for sport. It is a good thing when a king kills such men himself. The shout that went up was the sound a river makes when ice breaks and it finds its way to sea. Ramsay fled. Of course he fled. He took two boys with him as shields and cut them loose when the horses flagged under extra weight. And in the end, it was not a king who caught him, but a woman whose sons and daughters he had hunted with dogs. A woman whose knife had skinned her share of stags. �12 dragged him by his hair to the yard and set her boot on his neck until he stopped speaking, which improved the air. Daenerys watched without the satisfaction some men expected of her. She hated a certain sort of cruelty too much to take pleasure in its ending. When it was done, when the pink banners were ash and the gates stood open and the hearths were burning with wood that had been stacked with care, Robb led her to the gods, would not as a queen to be shown a future domain but as a wife to be shown a heart. The heart tree there watched them with its old carved face. The air beneath it was cooler even than the snow. She put her hand on its bark and felt the whisper of things that did not speak in words. She did not know those gods and they did not know her, but they knew a marriage when they saw one. "We will rebuild," Robb said. "Not as it was, as it should be now." "As it should be," she echoed. They set men to roofs and to the vaulting of the great hall. They sent youths to gather stones nobody claimed, and had the oldest of the old sit in the meantime by the fire in the broken kitchen with the pots they had cooked in for years. Daenerys set women to counting stores and to rites. She watched the quiet commerce of widows who had learned how to keep boys alive when there were no men left to do it. She listened to their judgments and changed the punishment of a boy caught stealing to a debt repaid in work with his hands rather than a beating that would have shamed him. She learned the names of men who had died at the Dreadfort who had been as gentle as a summer day and men who had lived who would never be, and began to understand what it was to be known by a place. There were ravens, always. One came black as all the rest and carried words from the wall that were white as panic. Robb read Jon's hand and his mouth drew back from his teeth as if to laugh, but he did not laugh. "Wildlings," he said, and Daenerys came to his side and read with him. "A army of free folk under a man who calls himself king. Giants. Gods help us, giants. And worse to follow," he says. "Shadows in ice. Whites." He looked up, and the gray in his eyes was winter. "We do this now," he said. "We put an end to lion and squid. We scrape them off us like burrs. Then we face what my father kept his eyes on through all those years other men let their backs grow soft by their fires. Then we turn south first and make quick work," Daenerys said without drama. "I have no interest in thrones that are not a means to something else." He kissed her hair. "You have interest in what matters," he said. "Some men will never forgive you that." They moved swift. Oars bit the white knife in a rhythm that carried men south faster than any mooted long plan could ever hope. The Iron Men had taken to their ships like always. It is hard to hold the neck against fire from above. Victorian Greyjoy had cleverness of a kind, but cleverness is not immunity against a girl who rides a dragon. Dany burned the longships where they bunched like roaches under ledges, and Xalo Sellsails turned out their pockets and dropped oars to be picked up by men who took coins and kept rowing, whose loyalty, while bought, could be counted on while the purse was not empty. The Greyjoys went back to their islands carrying a message written on men's skins not by flaying, but by scar: "Do not come north." Meanwhile, Roose Bolton returned to see Winterfell's banners flying and did not change his face except in his eyes. He came to bend knee without being asked, a model of grace, and offered up letters from Tywin Lannister that could be read as bribes or traps or both. "You have always been a good reader," Catelyn told him. "You can read my face too. My son knows what mercy is and what it costs. He will pay it when it brings him profit. He will not pay it when it buys him knives for his back." Roose made a show of looking around as if to count knives in evidence. It was well acted. He had often practiced. In the days that followed he was mild as milk, an uncle with a soft laugh. Daenerys watched him and smiled when he smiled and asked him stories of the Dreadfort and of the old days and let him think she was reading the wrong book while Drogon lay with one eye half open as if he was asleep with his tooth pressed lightly into the wood of the dais. "But why spare him at all?" the great Jon asked, halfway between outrage and appetite. "He smells like maggot meat. He bleeds like a Southron who sends other men to die for him and keeps his hands soft." "Because he has men," Robb said. "Because I have need of them, and because killing him prices me like a man who kills when he is angry, not when it profits him." He glanced at Daenerys. "And because we will be better than lions." "Lions are sometimes better than their legend," she said wryly. "We will be better than ours." Sansa wrote from King's Landing on paper thin enough to see the fear through. The hand that wrote was steady because she had learned how to make it so, and the words were the words of a clever child forced to grow cleverer by need. Cersei's smile was a Flynn's thing. Joffrey's temper had the temperament of an acid. Tyrion Lannister had a mind that ticked and clacked like one of the Maester's little toys, and while he could not stop a flood, he could teach the city how to climb higher so the water rose around something that mattered less than the people. She wrote of Tommen, little and broad-faced, of Marjorie Tyrell with flowers in her hair and steel under her tongue, of metal hammered on the steps of the Great September that would soon be armor for boys not yet old enough to need it. Daenerys read Sansa's letter twice and stared at Robb a long time after, weighing what he knew and what he needed to hear as if she held the blade of truth and did not want to nick him with it too soon. "We do not take King's Landing by storm," she said at last. "We are not my father." "You say that as if I were thinking of it," he said, and his mouth crooked. "I know walls when I see them. We will take their ships from under them, and we will make it cost them to be proud. We will close their gates and wait until their bellies drive them out, and we will open the gates then. We will put our dragons over the Blackwater with chains," she said, half to herself. "And we will burn the supplies going in and let the food going out pass to the poor. We will make the city feel what it feels like to be ruled and kept alive." They did not put chains on dragon necks. Daenerys would sooner have put her hands in a brazier, but they used time and fire. They met Stannis Baratheon to the east in Parley on a cape that had felt dragon shadow under a different sun. "I know what you call yourself," Stannis said, and his mouth's line used the same pencil it always had. "If anyone else called you it, I would hang him for a traitor, but you were born to it, and that is a thing the gods are, but no. The gods arrange nothing. Men arrange it and God takes the blame." "Is it Lord's truth you speak?" Robb asked mildly. "Or King's?" "The only truth is that the realm bleeds," Stannis said. "I mean to stitch it. You mean to stitch it too. The difference between us is that I mean to count every stitch. You mean to see the cloth in my hands and pretend it is yours. It is not." "Then let us cut different cloth," Daenerys said with a trace of amusement. "I will take King's Landing and the Lannisters will kneel or be crushed. You will keep the Stormlands and call yourself what you like so long as you give me ships when I ask and keep the Night Watch supplied when winter comes. Or we will fight and I will win." Melisandre stood just behind Stannis' shoulder like a promise given and refused. She watched Daenerys with a mother's pride and a rival's interest, both. "You were born in storm and you carry it in you," she said softly. "You are no shadow. You are a flame." "I am," Daenerys said, "and I have learned not to warm myself on it." In the end, Stannis did what men like him do when corners offer numbers. He took his bargain. He trimmed it with his own words and made it feel like his. Davos Seaworth shook his head as if a fisherman watching a clever net. "You will not burn the city," he said in a low aside when they stood apart and watched the sea put up its tired afternoon glitter. "No," Daenerys said, "not unless it burns me first." They put their ships on the Blackwater like a hand on a throat. The city lived still. It must. Cities do not die from strangling alone unless they want to. Tyrion, it turned out, did not want it to. He put boys on the walls who had not yet known a man's hand on their shoulder in thanks and taught them to loose arrows and duck before the arrow returns. He made mock of the siege with jests that did not taste like ashes and that changed nothing but made men laugh, which changes something. He sent food to the poorest first and let the rich stew in their own sealed kitchens. He had a wary respect for dragons and a frank terror of winter. Sansa came out of the city not as part of a truce, but as part of a game that had grown too hot for Cersei's hands. The Tyrells had no love for a wolf, but they liked a lion less, and they understood better than any that a queen whose banner was a dragon would grate fewer old feuds raw than a queen whose banner was a rose. Marjorie met Daenerys in a tent with only women in it, and they spoke plainly for an hour. There was almost warmth at the end, or its promise. "If you make room for us at your table, we will not put our elbows on it without your leave," Marjorie said, and her mouth did not quite smile. "And we will bring a dish you have not tasted before. I suspect you have many recipes," Daenerys said. "You are welcome if you feed the hungry." They ate the Lannisters with calm. Tywin Lannister died not in a privy with a crossbow bolt in his gut, but in his dais chair on a day when he realized there were no routes left to take out of the city that did not run through someone else's mercy. His heart stopped when he saw the northern standards and dragon banners in the same wind. So the maester said. Tyrion sat in chains for a while because men like to chain those who might be more dangerous without them. He was let out when it became clear he could do more chained to the new Queen's council than to the memory of the old king's father. He took his place as the man who measured rooms and made the corners fit. The Iron Throne did not cut Daenerys the first time she sat it. It regarded her with what passed for a throne's interest, and she regarded it with what passed for a queen's contempt for furniture. Robb stood a half step to her right on the day she was crowned before the eyes of men whose eyes had seen crowns since they were boys and did not love what they saw. The cheers were not the deeper thing the North made when it sang, but there were cheers, and the city kept from tearing itself apart in fear on the first night and the second. On the third night it snowed, a little flurry that startled men in Spring Street and made the fishwives laugh. The snow did not stick. Not then. They did not tarry. If Daenerys had been born to the Iron Throne, she might have kept to it as if it were a hearth. She had not been, and its metal did not warm her. They crossed the neck again in late autumn with speed learned from battles already fought and with ravens racing ahead. The wall rose out of the world like a piece of the sky pushed down wrong. It made even a dragon's size feel like a trick of perspective, not a fact. Drogon bristled and hissed and then went quiet, which was worse. The cold put sharp teeth into every place on a man's body that had ever bled. When Jeor Mormont embraced Robb, his smile was as broad as winter and had as many fissures. "You did not forget us," he said, and the respect in his face was a pain in Robb's chest. "We were brought up not to forget," Robb said. "We were taught to count." Jon came down the steps too quickly and then stopped and stood in the yard with Boyshock making his mouth open in spite of himself, because there was Robb, and beside Robb a queen with hair like fresh snow and eyes that belonged in stories, and above them a dragon with its wings folded like a tent. Ghost came with him, and Grey Wind and Ghost sniffed each other and acknowledged what they had both always known. Jon closed the last two steps in a rush and clapped his brother on the arms hard enough to bruise. "You are taller," Robb said, outraged, and it broke something open in both of them. So they laughed like boys in the yard at Winterfell when the world was proofed and safe. Daenerys watched them with a face that had learned to hid its longings well, then came forward and put her hand out, and Jon bowed not because she was a queen but because he had learned to treat women with courtesy, and it lined up with what he felt. "Your Grace," he said. "Jon Snow," she said, trying the name as if it were a spice a traitor had given her with a smile and a warning. "Your brother speaks of you as if you were the better part of him." "That is because he is the better part of me," Jon said, and surprised them all. The talk soon turned to the enemy who did not count ships or reckon on harvests. Mance Rayder had fallen back from the first shove and then the second. He had learned and come on again. Jon spoke of him with the respect a soldier keeps for a man who keeps his own counsel and owes no lord his obedience. "He wants to bring his people south of the wall before the dead come in earnest," he said. "Every night a few more rise. Some nights more than a few." "Fire," Daenerys said quietly. "And Valyrian steel," Jon said, then reddened as if he had overstepped. "What little there is." "And dragonglass," Samwell Tarly put in from the edge of the group, flushing, because he was the sort of man who flushed when speaking truth to kings. "We found it. We used it. It works." "Then we mine it," Robb said, with a relief that made his shoulders drop. "We mine it like we mined iron when the war began and there were no good swords to be had. We put a quarry in the earth and we take out the very night." They made ready. Dragonglass was hacked from the earth in ugly blade shapes that cut men and then something better than men. Men learned to wrap their hands better and not mind bleeding. Valyrian steel was counted and then lent as if it were faith. The free folk looked down from the ridge of the world at the banners of dragon and wolf and laughed or spat, as they would, until they saw the dragons stretch their wings and felt heat on their winter-burned faces and understood that stories had come north again to hold the line. When the dead came, they came as the sea comes. A long dark line that does not look like anything until it is upon you and then is the only thing in the world. They moved badly and they moved inexorably. They did not tire. Fear ran through the living ranks, first in little shivers and then in waves. And then fear subsided into the work of living. Men always have work, even when fear stands up next to them and calls them by name. The dead broke on fire that was hotter than any hearth and cleaner than any plague. Fire took them like a _�MRC taking a fever. Daenerys rode above the cold and felt the cold rise like teeth, and still she did not bend down her head. She burned and burned, and when the dragon's breath grew rough, she reached forward and placed her hand on the scales until he steadied. Robb rode where he could see and be seen, and did not let his hand shake when he ordered boys younger than he had ever thought he would trust with a spear to do what must be done. A shape larger than fear came out of the storm, a great pale rider whose mount was a nightmare of frost. The world's sound narrowed to the placement of hooves and the creak of ancient leather. Jon went at him with a sword that remembered fire from when it was forged and did not forget it now. They met, and the meeting was a note that hurt the ear and yet made something in the heart stand up. The blade struck, and the rider's blade struck back, and the air between them tore like cloth in hands. It was not one blow that did it. It was a man refusing to let his weight be thrown backward, and the thing that had been a man not understanding stubbornness. When it broke all along the line, as if the cold had been stitched together and one stitch had been cut. The whites fell like puppets whose strings are suddenly taken from them. The sound of things that do not breathe falling is terrible. It is a sound no man forgets. It is a sound a woman remembers when she stirs soup and watches a child's lip quiver at a dream. It is the sound of mercy arriving late and still in time. After men looked at each other with faces that had always been their faces but that had learned new tricks. Some wept without noise. Some laughed too loud. Some slept where they stood, and when they woke had to be told where they were. Jeor Mormont held his son's hand and did not cry where anyone could see, and then cried alone, which is how the proud give in to being human. Jon stood with his hands at his sides until Ghost pushed against him as if to say enough pretending. Then he let himself be held by his brother and shook once, clutched hard, and was still. In the quiet that came after there was talk of years. Winter had not ended. It would not end for a while. The North would need salt meat and clever hands and somebody to tell the old stories in a way that made boys want to be the kind of men who would make new ones. The South would need laws that did not suit the powerful and bread that did not suit the greedy. Only then would either realm deserve the names it loved for itself. They returned to Winterfell and moved through rooms that had learned men's breath again and now needed to learn laughter. Daenerys stood in a window arrow slit at dusk with the hall's rekindled warmth at her back and snow falling slow outside, each flake a little decision to rest where it fell. She would never be truly warm. She had known that since she was born into storm and learned to love fire without needing it to be the only thing that steadied her. She lifted her hand and caught a flake, and it melted at once because she had heat in her even in that cold. Robb came to stand beside her. He did not announce himself. She knew him by the way the air around her changed. "My mother tells me I am less foolish than I was," he said. "She may be trying to be kind." "She is a Stark," Dany said. "If she is trying to be kind, it is because you have earned it." He considered that with the seriousness of a king and a boy. "You did not ask me what I saw when I first saw you," he said after a moment, as if it had just come to him that this was something to be asked. "I saw someone," she said, "who would break or hold. I could not tell which. I decided to see. I saw a woman the tales lie about easing to themselves," he said. "And then I saw a person who would beat me across a deck with the truth if I needed it. I needed it. You give me what I need too," she said, and the quiet between them was not fragile. They made a life then, as men and women have always done when the work of dying pauses for a while and the work of living insists. It was a life that meant turning to bread rather than banners more often than not, that meant setting judges instead of generals and deciding which men whose hands were calloused would sit in rooms that had once been the domain of men whose hands were soft. It meant sending 𝒂𝒊𝒕𝒆 Tarly south to gather words and bring them north to boys who needed them, and sending Arya, when she returned as she would, with letters tucked under her jacket because she knew how to pass unnoticed where even birds might be seen. It meant letting Tyrion Lannister build things and then suggest what came to be called the Concord of Winter, a charter that spoke plainly of the two realms bound in one marriage, with councils that would overlap and part with the ease of hands that had learned each other's lines. Roose Bolton did not stay patient forever. Men like him do not. He tried to slip his knives back into the world through a wedding of someone's cousin. Cheap of him and mean, but it was hard to plot where dragons perched. He disappeared one morning down a corridor that led to a room where Regal had taken to sleeping. He did not come out. Some whispered that the bastard had eaten the father. Daenerys said nothing on such matters. She did not need to. The North was not a place where men's bodies were flayed and hung for admiration any longer. It had a cleaner way of swallowing the disloyal. Catelyn laughed sometimes. It was a small thing and a great one. She sat with Sansa and brushed her hair and told her that she would not push her into any bed until Sansa chose it. And Sansa said that choice might be a greater weight than fate, and they both smiled. Bran traveled in dreams to places his body could not go and came back to sit and speak with a wise intentness that made Tyrion's mouth turn wry, as if confronted with a boy who would be the only man to beat him at 𝒖𝒏𝒊𝒕𝒆 and not brag. Rickon ran with wolves in a way that made the kennel master throw up his hands and then laugh, and Osha kept her knife where she could reach it and her laughter where men thought they owned it and did not. In the south, Marjorie put her elbows on Daenerys' table when told not to and then took them off with a smile and made the court do what needed doing while laughing. Stannis broke like a rock breaks, crack by crack and piece by unglorious piece, until there was a man beneath who knew he was tired and asked Davos to tell him when to sleep. The Faith howled and was told to sing instead, and some learned how. Others howled until their throats broke and no more noise came. Years are made of days. Winter became a thing men spoke of as something that had been rather than something that would be forever. The dragons grew and learned wisdom as well as fire. There is wisdom in knowing what not to burn. Children were born who had both wolf in their eyes and dragon in their spines. Some had neither and were loved as well because they laughed with the ease of those who expect love and are not surprised to find it. The concord held. It had been hammered hard by things that wanted to ruin it, and hard-hammered things last. On an evening that came without snow for the first time in many, Robb and Daenerys walked the battlements of Winterfell. The sky was such a blue it made you think of the old songs where summer's promise is a kind of prayer. Below, a girl who was all legs and quick temper tried to climb a wall she had been told not to and slid the last bit laughing. A boy unrolled a map and weighted it with stones. A woman of 40 who had seen too much and still found more rose every morning to make soup in a pot too big to be called anything else. "Do you ever think it could have been different?" Robb asked, not looking at her but down, where the girl tried again to climb and this time reached the top and put her fist in the air as if she had won a battle that would be remembered. "It could have," Dany said. "I could have burned not enough and too much. You could have kept a vow to a petty lord and broken the world. Your mother could have died of sorrow. Your sister could have not learned to write her own letters." She slipped her hand into his. "But we did as we did. And we will do again," he said, and squeezed her fingers not because he feared she would fade like breath in winter, but because men who have been given life a second time like to be reassured the world will not shy away when they grip it. "We will go on counting. We will," she said, and up above them the dragons rolled in the slow air, black and green and gold, and their shadows passed over the stones and over the faces of those who looked up, and nobody flinched. The shadow of a dragon can be terror. It can also be a promise. The North had learned the difference. The realm had learned the difference. Under their promise, the world did not stop turning. It turned as it always had, toward winter and then away, toward sorrow and then toward bread, toward banners and then toward tables, toward the small voices in the morning that say what's for breakfast with such faith it could make gods of those who answer. What had been done was not neat. It had not been pretty. It had been work, the kind that leaves splinters under the nail and aches that only leave when you put your feet up by the fire and listen to someone you love speak of something that matters and realize it matters more than your pain. They stood and watched the world they had made and the world that made itself despite them. The wind did not forget what it was. It lifted Daenerys' hair and made Robb's cloak tap the stones. The old gods did not forget either. The leaves in the gods' wood rustled where there was no wind. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere an old man coughed a cough that would prove to be the law. St. somewhere two lovers fought and reconciled and fought again and reconciled with less fury because they were older and kinder and knew when to leave a room. The dragon stooped and rose and stooped again. Grey Wind lay at the edge of the yard with his head on his paws. He was grizzled now, as wolves do grow when they have been fortunate enough to be given years. Ghost lifted his head, and a sound that was less than a howl and more than a sigh came out of him. Jon turned from the wall to listen and smiled with the piece of his face that had always known how. Daenerys leaned her head against Robb's shoulder just for a breath. "We will be remembered for our wars," she said, "but I would rather be remembered for our harvests." "Then let us be," he said. "That too is war." They went inside. The hall was warm. The cooks had burned something, and it smelled a little of char even above the sweet of honey. And Tyrion was arguing with Bran about a matter so small it had to be important. And Catelyn stood by the fire and rolled her eyes and then laughed with Sansa. A boy who would grow to be a man with a gentle hand huddled on a bench and practiced the letters of his name on a scrap of parchment with his tongue between his teeth. A girl with dark hair and a scar she could have chosen to hide and did not play at knives in a way that had made the maester sigh and then give up and give her better knives. Above all of it, the rafters held smoke and old stories and the promise of new ones. Outside, night took its time coming on, as if reluctant to close its hand over a day that had done more mending than tearing. When it came at last, it came softly, and the fires in the keeps flared like eyes. No one looked at the Iron Throne that night. No one thought of it, save perhaps a boy in a tavern 1,000 leagues away who was telling a tall tale about a queen who walked through fire and a king who bent no knee, and somehow they had made something together that did not break in the first hard year. If there were gods in the wood listening, they listened without blinking. If there were dragons dreaming above the yard, their dreams were full of both bone and sunlight. In the morning, men would go out and reckon how much grain had been spoiled by late not cold, and how many shoes would be needed if the roads melted earlier than was usual. In the morning, ravens would come. But for now the hall was full and the brood was warm, and there was meat on the board and laughter like a rope binding men to the beam of a ship. The world turned. They turned with it, not against it, holding fast where they must and letting go where it was time. And in that turning, what had once been only rumor across a narrow sea, dragons and vows and a girl with silver hair, settled into the grain of the realm like a thread that would not rot, something strong enough to sew torn things back together when the time came again, as it always does. The night breathed at the windows while the hall drank and cooled, and by morning the stones of Winterfell steamed in the first sun like animals rising from sleep. In the months that followed, the work of piecing a realm to itself moved the way ice thaws in a river, slowly in the open, and then all at once where no one can see. Men left off drilling to stand in gates repairing lintels. Women who had learned to tie a tourniquet in the dark exchanged strips of cloth for tally sticks and kept count of oats, lamp oil, and hands. Whispers that had been all fear and flame softened into things men told to quiet babies or to start work with a grunt and a smile. The queen rides a dragon, and she prefers her fish roasted with lemon rather than boiled. And when the butcher's boy came up short, she sent him away with a sack of barley besides the coin. And, best of all, she kept her fire from houses whose beams could still be saved. The king, men said, turned his spear in the yard like he meant it and laughed like his father had when there was a reason for it. Daenerys rose early, before the maids came in to lay the fires, and stood at the arrow slit of their chamber listening to the slow drip from eaves. She found that the north made a quiet unlike any she knew. No insect throb, no market cry, only a breathing so deep it could have been the earth. She did not need warmth as much as others did. She had carried a little flame inside her since she walked out of Drogo's pyre, and it did not go out in snow. One morning, as she pulled on her boots, she felt her stomach turn gently, like a fish in a bowl. It was no pain at all, only a tide, and yet it made her sit and lay her palm against herself with a shock of small, clean fear that was not fear. She told Catelyn first, not because she feared to tell Robb, but because the piece of the telling needed to be carried by a woman who had known both ends of such news. Catelyn stood still and then held her face in both hands as if to lift it toward light. "I will pray at the tree," she said simply, "and then we will do what women do, we will keep you well." When she told Robb, She told him while they walked the yard where a boy with hair like wheat was learning to spur a pony without kindness. Robb looked at her as if he had just been told something he had known all his life he would never have. And then, because he was Robb, he breathed once and set his hand over hers without being possessive of what lay beneath. "Good," he said, with a steadiness that made her throat choke. "We will be as careful as if we were crossing on ice. And we will not act like we are afraid of it. Your law," she teased. "Always count." He smiled. "Counting keeps men alive," he said. "I have found it keeps joy alive too." He sent ravens south that very day, not with boasting but with simple facts. "The queen is with child. The concord holds. Send what gifts you mean to send, if gifts you mean to send." Tyrion wrote back from King's Landing with a dry line about how gifts were cheaper than wars and how he preferred the former, though the latter gave him more to do. Marjorie sent a shawl embroidered with winter roses that looked almost real enough to fool a bee. Stannis sent a shipload of salt fish and a stark note that said fish do not spoil when they are salted and children do not spoil when they are told no. And Davos, in a letter of his own, said he had no wisdom on the matter of children, but plenty on the matter of fish, and if the queen would have him, he would come north and show the boys how to net herring through a slush. Daenerys rode north again with Robb before her belly was more than a rumor beneath her gown. She wanted to look at the wall as Alysanne had looked at it, not to compare her own courage to a dead queen's, but to learn the shape of the fear that had kept men on that height for thousands of years. "If you bring a child into this world, you had best know what kind of cradle you lay it in," she told Robb, who nodded as if she had said something he had been thinking long before she spoke. At Queen's Gate the wind blew like a blade, clean and honest, daring you to call it cruel. The watch assembled for her in ranks that were not perfectly straight and did not need to be. Old men with white stubble on their cheeks stood shoulder to shoulder with boys whose eyes had learned to look over a wall and not down at their own boots. Jeor Mormont wore his great cloak with the bear on it and did not allow his face to grow soft as he kissed her hand. Jon stood beside him with snow in his lashes. Ghost paced between Grey Wind's slower, older strides, and the two great hounds carried the air of animals who know they have seen something few others have. Daenerys listened more than she spoke. She let the Lord Commander tell her about the new gift and the lands that had been meant for the Watch and had in truth become no man's responsibility and every man's afterthought. She walked the ruined crofts and the old stone fences that kept out nothing but the memory of cows. She went into a house whose shutters hung by the last screw and stood with her fingers on the splintered lintel for a long moment. "This is not a fort," she said, half to herself. "This is a hearth. There should be chickens in the yard and someone scolding a dog for edging too close to the stew." "We haven't stew," said a voice boldly, and she turned to find a girl with hair cut short as a boy's staring back, her cheeks raw from wind, a bundle on her hip that shifted and squeaked. Gilly stood without fear and without shame, as a person who has learned there is no profit in either. "But I've a pot," she said. "If there was something in it." Daenerys asked her name and thanked her and sent men back south with speed to bring grain and to set up a granary under a trust of both the Watch and the nearest small folk, so that men would not look at a storehouse and see a lord's larder but their own. "No man is fed by a cymbal," she said. "He is fed by a spoon." In a little town beyond the wall, she visited a woman with a child tied to her back and listened to the woman speak of a husband who had been a raider when the season was bad and a father when it was good. "He did not come back," the woman said simply. "We do what we do." Daenerys came away with the knowledge that there are no strange people. There are only strangers, and when you bring them close, most of them turn into neighbors if you let them. At Castle Black, she stood upon the top of the wall and looked out at a world clean and unmarked and baleful in its beauty. Drogon did not like the cold, but he liked the height. He strutted along the ice with his wings out to feel the hum in them, and when he leaned his head over to look, she put one hand on his neck and the other on her belly, as if to tell two worlds at once that she was not afraid. Robb stood a little apart with Jon and the old bear. "She's brave," Jeor Mormont said without any awe, as he would say the truth about a horse's gait. "Brave goes a long way. It does not do everything." "It does not," Robb agreed, "but it gets you to the gate." He smiled sideways. "What remains is counting what comes next." Jon's eyes were on Ghost's ears as they flattened against the cold. "We meant to be boys forever," he said, with no bitterness. The world had other ideas. On the way south, they stopped at the Queen's Crown and found it half fallen, the old tower leaning like a man who knows he cannot sit without pain. Daenerys laid her palm against the stone. "Alysanne brought what she had to bring when she came," she said. "I am not her, but I will bring what I have." She set men to repair the tower and to roof it true and to hang a board at its door saying in plain words who had the right to shelter there. Everyone. And she had a bench set outside beneath a little awning for old men to sit and tell children what they remembered when the snow melted. The child quickened like a fish again, then like a bird. In Winterfell, the women began their counting: linens, herbs, the midwife, the spare midwife, hot water and cool, the names for those who should be called first and those who should be turned out of the room. Catelyn sat by the window with an old pleated fan in her lap, as if it were summer, and moved it idly while the younger women bustled. "The gods will have their say," she told Daenerys, "and so will your body. Our work is to listen to both without panic." She smiled with half her mouth. "Panic will have its say too if you let it." Robb forbade nothing and insisted on nothing. He moved the way a man moves when he knows he is needed both in the hall and at a bedside, stepping from map table to hearth and back like a dancer. He sent men to the Dreadfort to collect those who were not traitors and to rebuild it without flaying wrecks. He wrote to the Riverlands and set a moot at Riverrun to redistribute lands taken by the worst of the Freys, and he did it with a justice that made Lord 𝒊𝒓𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 turn at last from calculation to similarity to fury. In King's Landing, Tyrion kept the city from eating itself by the simple method of feeding it, and by the more complicated method of making men, who thought they were too good to carry sacks of barley, do it anyway for a month. "There is a dignity in sweat I have underestimated," he told Sansa on a morning when the river steam turned the city into a hidden thing. "You will be queen someday without needing a crown. Learn this early." The birth took a night and a day. The labor twisted like a rope around Daenerys's ribs, but it did not break anything it should not break. She stood when she was told to stand, and braced when told to brace, and listened to her own breath when told by no one. The kettle steamed. Catelyn's hand was firm as any soldier's and as gentle as a mother's could be when she laid cool cloth to Daenerys's neck. The midwife spoke very little. She had delivered too many babies to spend words where they did not help. When at last the great clean pain came and went and the world narrowed to the sound inside Daenerys's head, and then widened with a roar that was not a dragon's, someone said, "A girl," in a voice so surprised it almost sounded like joy. They named her Alysanne for a queen who had done more than sit a chair, and because the name sat well on the North's tongue. They named her Nymeria also, in a whisper, because Arya had loved the name once, and because there is power in choosing two women to shield a child. She had a thread of pale hair and a fierce little mouth and lungs that worked as if they had been practicing for months. Robb held her with hands that had killed and learned gentleness in the killing. He swayed without meaning to. "I will count," he said, and his voice was thick. "I will count every breath I can." The North cheered without pomp. In King's Landing, Marjorie danced a step in her chamber and told her grandmother that a queen who gave a daughter first made the realm a better place. And Olenna snorted and said a queen who knew how to keep her husband from getting stupid with pride was the best of all. Stannis sent a line that said girls can read ledgers as well as boys if you care to show them. Davos sent a call from a child in the Stormlands and a bit of sailor's superstition with it about luck at sea, and Catelyn smiled and put the token in the chest where she kept strings and the good needles. Far away in Sunspear, Doran Martell sat with a map on his knees and stared out the window toward the shadow of ships and breathed like a man who has learned patience for so long he could not stop if he tried. He sent a letter with a careful compliment to the Concord and a careful suggestion that winter would go faster if the rivers were able to rise without iron in them. He wrote also to his son in a hand that betrayed nothing about whether he grieved dreams that had been pointless or was relieved to have done with them. Arya came out of the far side of the world like a shadow stepping out of shade into sun. She arrived at White Harbor disguised as a fisher boy with a bad cough and no patience for the clumsiness of men who had only ever hauled nets that did not think. She watched the docks for a day, then another, and then walked up to the wolf's den and told the guard that if he laid hands on her she'd break his wrist, and when he laughed she did it, and when he stopped laughing, she handed him a bit of lemon cake she'd stolen to ease his hand and said sorry perfectly and not at all. Lord Wyman's laugh set his jowls madly to work when she walked into his hall and swung up onto the table like a cat. "That one is trouble," he said, "and I thank the gods for trouble returned." At Winterfell, she stood at the threshold of the hall and drew a breath like a diver and then walked in with her head up, because if she faltered, she would have gone back to the snow and slept there. Jon rose first, which made the rest easier. He did not run to her. He moved across the floor with the dangerous economy of a man who had learned not to stumble when he wanted to, and when he reached her, he picked her up by the shoulders and put his cheek to hers and did not speak. Robb came after, then Sansa, and then Catelyn, and by the time she finished being held, she was laughing and scowling and wiping her nose with the back of her hand and feeling 9 years old and 900. She watched Daenerys carefully over the rim of a cup. The queen watched her back, not with suspicion, but as if greeting someone whose language she did not speak yet and meant to learn. It did not take long. Arya sat with Alysanne on her lap, the baby patting at her chin with a damp fist, and lifted her eyes without warning. "When do I get to kill the ones who need it?" she asked. "You can't tell me there aren't any left." "There are always some left," Daenerys said, honest. "But I would rather you learned when not to first. That takes longer and costs more." Arya held her stare as if testing a wire. Then she grinned in spite of herself. "All right," she said, "but when we have to kill, I want to be first." "You will be near enough," Robb promised dryly. "You always are." The realm did not stand still to admire the baby or the reunited children of Winterfell. It turned and dragged and yielded and bucked. In the Riverlands, a mood of lords in the shadow of a fish stamped on a banner settled matters that had been left sharp too long. Edmure Tully sat with Rosalind Frey's hand in his and saw her belly swell, and it steadied him so that when Black Walder spoke up to claim lands he had taken by grief and shadows, Edmure laughed in his face, and the laugh did not endear him to his enemies but made his friends braver. Some Freys went away grumbling. Some Freys swore that for once they would be worth more than the mouth of a river. In the west, the Rock stayed shut, sullen and proud and holding its breath. Tyrion sent a ledger there with figures that could make even a lion blink and wrote that there were more ways to strangle a castle than with a siege. Some of those were by sums. In the Iron Islands, the sea heaved itself into something with a crown on it. Euron Greyjoy blew into Pike like a storm that had found a mouth. He brought with him a horn bound in rings of black, and a tale about dragons that made men lean forward who had never liked talk about anything they could not touch. "Blow this," he promised, "and a dragon will bend its neck for us as a maid bends hers for a lord." Whatever else he said was lost in the roar that follows a promise of mastery. Victarion frowned and touched the horn with suspicion. Asha watched with eyes that missed nothing. When Euron put the leather leash of lordship around the islands with easy hands, she went off to see if there were other collars to be had that would sit better. In Deepwood, 𝒬𝒐𝒏𝒊𝒕𝒆 found Northmen with long memories and women with longer ones, and she sat by a low fire and said that if the Dragon Queen would put a woman over the Iron Islands who had no taste for reaving, that woman would build ships worth more than any raid. When the proposal came north by Raven, Daenerys smiled in a way that made Missandei lift a brow with approval. "Will you end the taking?" Daenerys wrote to Asha. "Not because it is costly, but because it is filthy? Will you turn those hands to building and leave the killing to need instead of appetite?" Asha's answer was as honest as soup. "We can end the taking as trade," she wrote. "Men throw off a habit quicker if you give them something else to put on. We will make ships and sell them, and you will promise to buy them first if they are good. We will give you the names of those who go back to old ways, and you can nail their names up in your hall and kill them in your storybooks or on their decks as you please." They set the terms. Asha had to steal her own crown. No man in 𝒖𝒏𝒊𝒕𝒆 Islands was going to hand it to her, so she stole it with votes, with promise, with the glitter of coin and the thump of barrels of pitch, and when the blades came out she ducked them and made men trip over the new ropes. Euron laughed and let her have her little island of law and sent his ships south to tear holes in the reach instead, because he wanted a city whose towers cast long shadows, and Old Town had plenty. Marwyn lit a glass candle and saw nothing clear. That was warning enough. When the first reports came in from the Shield Islands that sails as black as the inside of a man's mouth were blotting the sea, The citadel pretended not to hear, and the high towers sent out galleys with silver prows that looked well for paintings and poorly in wind. Euron came on like a sickness that had learned to sing. He blew the horn he had bound in black iron, and men fell to their knees with their hands to their ears. Far away in Winterfell, Drogon lifted his head with a jerk so sudden it cut Daenerys' breath, and Rhaegal rolled on his side with a clatter of claws, and Viserion shuddered as if something had touched him with an ugly hand. "Someone is calling my children," Daenerys said, and her voice turned very soft, which was when those who knew her best stepped back. "We will go and take his mouth away." Robb kissed Alysanne's head and handed her to Sansa, who took her with the instant competence of a girl who had once learned how to hold her own breath. "Bring him back alive if you mean to look at him," Sansa said to Daenerys, whose smile was dagger-fine. "Kill him if you mean to think of him all your life." "We will bring back what wisdom allows," Robb said. He had gray in his hair now, a fine dust you saw only in certain light. He wore it well. They sailed from White Harbor with ships built in haste and care by men who thought better with a hammer in hand than with a map under it. Grey Worm stood on the prow of the Queen's flagship with a spear he had carved his own notch in, and Jorah made certain his sword belt sat true after so many months out of war. He had long since ceased asking himself whether he was in love with Daenerys or whether he loved her as a man loves the truth. There was nothing useful in the distinction. He only knew that the sight of her standing with one hand on the rail and the other on the low-crested spike of Drogon's back made his throat ache with the knowledge that men do not get many chances to choose what they will die for. The sea threw Euron's voice at them before anything else. It came in on the wind like a bitterness that had learned to wear honey. "Sister," he called to Asha's scouts in Reach fishermen's boats, "tell the bitch queen I can sing better than her lizards." He blew the horn and the sound ripped the air like a sheet of metal being torn by hands too strong to be human. Even men who had heard dragons screamed and clapped hands to ears. Drogon screamed back and bewled the wind with his chest, and Daenerys slapped his neck once. "No," she said, as calmly as if telling a puppy to sit. He fought the command like he would have fought a chain. Then he went still under her. Arrows rose, fell, rose again. The sea battle was a thing with too many moving parts and not enough room to learn them in. The Greyjoys cut in tight with low, hungry ships. The Manderly cogs lumbered like noble cows and crushed what was underfoot. Reach galleys leaned on their oars and made water hiss white at their bows. Euron's flagship topped a swell as if the sea loved him and wanted him to see what he owned. Robb fought where he could be seen and sent men where he could not, using flags and a whistle and the sure instinct of a man who had played at war when he was a boy and learned at the cost of friends how close the game lies to the grave. He put himself where collapse loomed and it mended. He pulled back where victory tempted and it held. Tyrion would have smiled to see it, and Jorah did not smile. He had stood behind men whose pride led them to show, and he had learned how rare it is to see a leader disappear into the work. Euron blew the horn again. Blood seeped from the lips of the man who held it and turned the corners of his mouth into slashes. Euron laughed and clapped him on the shoulder like a good host praising an entertainer. Drogon clawed at the air in rage. Rhaegal veered so sudden he cut a mast with the edge of his wing. Viserion dropped and rose and dropped again as if walking stairs in a house that tilted. Daenerys tasted metal and old fire and understood suddenly that the horn wanted not to command but to harm. Its power was pain, and pain is a master only until you see through it. She laid her cheek to Drogon's scales. "You know me," she whispered. "You know me." Jorah, on the quarterdeck of a ship built at White Harbor by the hands of men whose mothers loved them, saw the way Euron's archers were taking heart and knew it would not hold. He leaped to a nearby cutter and then to another as if the sea were stepping stones, cut a Greyjoy who tried to pull him down, boarded a galley with the high tower's lantern brass plate shining on the prow, and with 10 men and Grey Worm's dozen made their way in 3 hard breaths to the side of Euron's flagship. The ladder creaked. A Greyjoy's hand loomed and smashed. A man fell back and was caught by another and shoved forward again. Grey Worm went first over the rail because that is what an Unsullied does when ordered, and what Grey Worm did now when he ordered himself. Euron turned and grinned as if he had been waiting for this minute as a lover waits by a gate. "At last," he said. "At last something to do that isn't boring." He moved like a dancer who has chosen knives as partners and made them look graceful. Yora met him, and for a time there was no world but the space between two men who had chosen to live differently and meant to prove the other wrong with steel. Euron's blade flirted and lied. Yora's told the truth the way an old man tells it, with a weight of years behind every word. Grey Worm took men at the calves and ankles and throat. The man blowing the horn sagged and gulped air between notes and lifted the thing again. And Yora spared him a glance only to know where the ugliness was perched. Euron saw the glance and laughed, delighted like a boy, and thrust for Yora's belly like a gift. Yora turned it with a movement so slight it was almost contempt. The second time, Euron forgot to laugh. The third time he hissed and stamped his boot on a fallen man's wrist to take his dagger without bending. And when he had it, he threw it not at Yora but at the hornblower's throat. The horn cut off with a wet sound that made men retch. In the space that Howl left behind, Drogon's cry fell like a bell struck by a god. Rhaegal pitched and then steadied. Viserion soared like a boy told by his father that he may run now because the work is done. Daenerys pointed with her hand and Drogon came down like judgment. Euron looked up and smiled because he did not know how to stop. Fire took the prow and leapt for white sails that had been washed and scrubbed within an inch of their life. Grey Worm flung himself backward and dragged a man with him. Yora did not move until the last needed thing had been done. He pushed his blade forward, not with joy and not with hate, and felt it meet meat, then bone. Euron's grin faltered. He looked down at the sword in him as if it were a novelty and then lifted his eyes to Yora with something like relief. "Boredom," he whispered, and there was blood in it. "You saved me." "No," Yora said evenly. "I saved a great many others." He withdrew the blade. Euron swayed to the rail. The sea took him without ceremony. It had other things to do. The rest was work. Work is what keeps men from the kind of stories that ruin them. The fleet broke around the loss of its flagship like ice around a black rock in spring. The Greyjoys who could fled with oars holed and sails shredded and a wind that mocked them. The ones who could not died with knives in their hands and curses in their mouths. Daenerys did not set Old Town alight. She burned the ram that had boomed against its harbor chain, and she burned a battery of scorpions that had been rolled onto a pier with more hope than sense. She sat down in the plaza and let the city see her without a crown and saw it look back with the complicated look a city has for anyone who might rule it. The Hightowers sent 100 loaves and 100 bows with strings and 100 old swords that had been held only for show, and their father came down the broad steps with a slow, careful dignity and told Daenerys that a light in the harbor was only a light if there was something to be lit. In the citadel, men who had laughed at the notion of glass candles burning muttered in corners while one burned on a table and threw strange long shadows. Marwyn met Daenerys in the room with the sphere that mapped the world. He bowed without kneeling and without insult. "The trick isn't making the dead light," he told her, tapping the glass with a fingernail. "It's remembering what you wanted to see in the first place. The longer you look, the more the candle asks you to forget." He glanced at Drogon and grinned. A boy caught in a pantry with a stolen pie. "Some fires are truer than others. Keep your candle," Daenerys said. "Illuminate your friends." Word of Euron's death reached the islands like the end of a bad song. Asha did not rejoice. She hung black for eyes that had been taught to love him despite themselves and sent half the sails in her docks south with bread and tar in their holds. The Ironborn watched her and saw the shape of a new habit forming and were gruffly cynical about it. And then they did what she asked because it was easier than starving and less humiliating than being beaten. They learned to make keel timbers true and caulkings clean, and some of them learned to like the rhythm of a hammer more than the rhythm of a raid. Back in the north, Bran called Robb to the Godswood on a night that had the feeling of a page turning. He did not stand because he would not likely ever stand, but he seemed taller somehow, as some trees do when you have seen them 100 times and suddenly understand their height. "You are weaving," he told Robb, and his voice had taken on that tone it now had, as if he spoke a truth that was not merely his own. "You are weaving as wolves have always done. The web is stronger than you think." "I sometimes feel I am only tying knots," Robb confessed, "and my fingers slip." "Knots matter," Bran said. "A thing slips when it is meant to slip. That is not failure. It is design." The old gods do not tell us where to walk. They hand us a rope and say, mind your feet. You sound like Tyrion, Robb said, amused, and Bran blinked as if remembering the man's face and finding it tucked in a corner of his mind like a funny toy. I sound like everyone, he said soberly, and no one. He told Robb and Daenerys in his plain, precise way that the threat in the north had not died merely because one man, or what had once been a man, had gone into pieces. There are always more, he said without fear, but we have learned where they crack. It is enough for now. In King's Landing, the faith made a feint at power and found it met by something that was not a king's rage but a queen's steadiness. Daenerys went into the Great September and knelt not at an altar but in a side chapel where a weeping woman had left a little parcel of bread. She did this without announcement. The High Septon came to find her with his indignation already primed and had to stop to breathe when he came upon her sitting with her hands folded, looking like any woman waiting for a prayer to be answered. You must not put your dragons above the 7, he said eventually, when he had found his place again. I do not put dragons above bread, Daenerys said without heat. Nor you. Do your work and I will do mine. Leave me to mine and I will leave you to yours. Keep your men from wearing armor when you say mass, and I will keep mine from using church steps as a watchtower. My lady, he said stiffly, which was compromise. Marjorie watched with the admiration of one craftsman for another. You disarm them by refusing to play their game, she told Sansa that night as they pinned their hair. Remember that trick. It is worth 10 men and a well-baked tart. Will I have to disarm men? Sansa asked. Her voice was not fearful. She sounded as if she were looking at a seam to be run straight. You already do, Marjorie said. Whenever you do not let them make you what they want you to be. Theon came back like a tide that did not want to, but could not help it. He arrived at the King's Road's end a bundle of bone and stubbornness and pride with a crack in it. He presented himself at the gates and asked for Robb and got instead the sight of a wolf's head carved in the lintel and a boy in gray with a whistle at his neck who kept the calm of someone who had been told the worst that might happen and had survived the telling. Theon did not beg. He put his hands out to be bound and said with a voice that had been broken once and had not entirely mended that he meant to take the black if they would allow him. I have burned a place I loved, he said. I would make it up to snow and stone and suns where I can. Robb looked at him for a long time. There was a muscle that worked along his jawline, the one that had never truly learned to be still. He nodded. Take him, he told the guard, and do not forget he is a man. Men may yet be made. The column of men moving north toward the wall had women in it and a few boys, and they looked at Theon as they might look at a stump in a field, a thing to be walked around and not tripped over. He walked with them and did not ask for mercy, and at night when Ghost came to the fire he lifted his hand and let the beast breathe on it, and did not flinch. At Castle Black he bowed to Jeor Mormont with a bow that was the shape of humility without groveling. Serve, the old bear said, as if passing a sentence and lifting it. They held a great council in Old Town because the city had taken a scare and needed to feel important again to recover. The great lords came yoked to duty and the minor lords came yoked to pride. The Ravenry went mad with calling. They called it the Concord of Winter to its face now and nobody laughed. The terms were said in words men could not pretend to misunderstand. The North and the Crown were bound not by conquest but by marriage and law. Each realm's court would seat a third of its chairs with the other's men. The gift would be increased by 1 holdfast and 10 along the wall, taken not with the sword but with coin and good bargains. The Ironborn would be ruled by Asha Greyjoy by the will of their captains and the queen, and if the Ironborn took again by reaving, the fine would be exacted in hard labor and loss of ship. Dorne's laws of succession would be respected as their own. The faith would keep its swords in racks and its words in mouths. These things were carved in oak and iron and were blessed by 7 and bowed to by those who bent to trees and grunted approval by those who called only on their own names. Tyrion stood up at one point and spoke for so long and so cleverly that even men who hated him found themselves laughing. You will forget what I said, he concluded. But you will remember that you laughed, and that will soften your hearts toward what I said. Such tricks are all I have. Count me as a jester, then, but one who rings the bell at the right moment. Daenerys looked out from the dais at a room full of faces and saw, for an instant, all the shapes they could have taken if she had not been who she was when the fire met her. There were smears of blood on all those ghost faces. The hall stank of ash. She blinked, and the room came clean again, and she felt no triumph, only relief, the deep kind that feels like sleep after a fever. She took Robb's hand and tapped his knuckles twice with the pad of her thumb, the signal they had learned to use when the room was too full and words would be too loud. When Alysanne was old enough to stand, she took her first steps toward the weirwood because it was red, which drew her eye. She thumped along with her mouth open in astonishment at her own trick, fell, laughed, and beat a little heel against the root as if to tell it to move aside. The leaves shifted with no wind. "She will be terrible," Arya said approvingly. "In the good way." A year after the sea made a noise like metal tearing in men's heads, and Euron fell backward with a sword in him. Daenerys brought Regal to Old Town's harbor and set him on the Hightower's quay so gently that the stone did not crack. The people came as close as the soldiers would let them, and then as close as the soldiers did not notice. She walked into the citadel with 𝒚𝒐𝒖𝒏𝒂𝒈 and 2 Unsullied who would die before they let anyone lay a hand on either. Marwyn met them with a glass candle in his fist and a smile in his beard. 3 other archmasters stood behind him looking like men who had stumbled onto a shore they had not known existed and were pretending they had always lived there. "You have a law to ask of us," Marwyn said before she spoke, "and we have a law to ask of you." "I will hear yours if you hear mine," Daenerys said. "If it is good, I will obey it." Marwyn's eyes crinkled. "This one is. It is an old one, and we have been neglecting it. It is the law that knowledge is a fire that must be tended, else it goes out. We ask for coin and protection for the work of making boys into men who remember what they have seen, and girls into women who do the same. We will show you where our books grow too comfortable and need the goad of a dragon's heat to make the ink run fast again. My law," Daenerys said, "is that any man who claims a horn that speaks to dragons is to be put in irons before he draws breath to sound it. Such horns are forbidden. Let your men hunt them. Let your boats sink them. Let there be one song about them in every village, and let it be a lullaby that says there was a bad man who blew a horn, and then the sea ate him because he did not know how to be patient. We will sing it into the ears of stubborn old men," Marwyn said, "the hardest heads to soften." When they returned to Winterfell that autumn, the air had that taste that makes men think of chopping wood and women think of putting away woolens to keep the moths out. Alysanne learned the word for mine and applied it to everything she could see. Her spoon, her cup, her mother's braid, gray wind's tail, the moon. She reached for the moon and fell backward and did not cry because she had learned that some pains are small and break if you do not feed them. Daenerys watched her and saw in the set of her head a piece of Viserys. Not the bad piece, but the boy who had once clung to her when the world frightened him and let her untangle his hair. She had not loved him the way a sister learns to love a boy who will become a man. She loved him now absurdly in the look on her daughter's face when Alysanne realized she had done something no one else had done. Put a handprint in mud, made a noise with her palm on ice. A son came after, the labor harder and the cry that filled the hall thinner at first. He was angry because getting born had been work. He yelled at the world for asking it of him and calmed only when put skin to skin with his mother. They named him Eddard, and the hall's breath caught. Catelyn put her hand to her mouth and bowed her head without care for who saw. "He had better be stubborn," she said when she could speak, "else he will be unworthy of his name." He was stubborn in the right ways, at the breast, at sleep, at the business of learning how to hold his head up against the weight of it. With 2 children in the nursery, Winterfell felt once again like a place with springs under the stone. Laughter took routes it had not trod in years. The kitchens produced sugared things at odd hours and nobody scolded. Robb walked the yard with Eddard against his shoulder and did not pretend to listen when men interrupted him. And they forgave him for it because they had seen him with a sword and knew that kindness in a man who killed true is not to be mocked. Daenerys split her time between council table and cradle. She made law in the morning and took Alysanne to watch the women beat rugs at noon and let Viserion scatter geese at wash when the sun was low because she could not resist the child's laughter. It is a mercy to a realm when its rulers' tastes run toward such amusements. News still came with teeth. Beyond the wall, a pocket of dead rose where the ground had been cold even in summer and the watch had to march further than they liked to make it sit down again. Gior wrote that he was too old to do this forever, and Jon sent his own letter with a line that said nothing except "we will do what we must," and that was enough because it had to be. In the Stepstones, a pretender who called himself Aegon landed with sellswords who had forgotten to be hungry by the time they reached shore and remembered it very quickly afterward. He proclaimed himself with a ring of black around his banner. He wrote letters in a hand taught by a man who had thought too much of himself. Tyrion read one and raised an eyebrow and said he had seen that penmanship on a bill for oysters and that it had been more honest there. They sent ships. Stannis met the boy where the islands gnawed at each other and bled him very carefully without killing him, and then sent him away on a boat with a stern small smile and a purse full of enough coin to make him choose another name and another continent. "Kingship is an illness," he told Davos with satisfaction as he watched the sail dwindle. "Sometimes it can be sweated out." The last of the worst of the phrase died as old men do, with words drying on their tongues and looks that sought a face they did not find. Some better phrase traveled to White Harbor and asked Lord Wyman for a chance to make that name mean something a man could say in the marketplace without getting a fish thrown at him. Wyman tested them by making them count out wheat grains into sacks until their backs ached, and then asked them to name the men their grandsires had wronged. When they could, he gave them work that helped men stand and meat that helped men sleep. "This is how you repair a name," he told them. "You do not paint it, you mend it." There were more councils and very few battles. There were harvests that failed and hands that did not. There were storms that took roofs and not courage. There were other babies, born to women who had stood with Daenerys bearing down and taken comfort from remembering the look on her face. There were deaths, and some made the hall's light dim and some passed almost unmarked except to the one heart that went on beating lonelier afterward. There was the slow end of winter, which is less a thing you can see than a thing that steals on you like a lover and makes men stand one morning and say the air smells different and women stand in doorways and frown and then nod because it does. On the day the snows finally cracked along the long roofs and slid off with a whump like bread falling from a peel, Robb stood on the battlements and watched the water sheet down. Daenerys came to his side with Eddard on her hip and Alysanne with a smear of soot on her nose because she had been forbidden the kitchens and then allowed in, which was as good as any victory. Below them, Grey Wind rose stiffly and walked across the yard like an old soldier feeling sun on his face. Ghost loped beside him and bumped his shoulder, and Grey Wind showed his teeth and then swayed and leaned into the nudge with something like relief. "You remember in White Harbor," Robb said, "when we went to the gods would to ask whether the tree thought we were fools?" "I remember," Daenerys said. "I thought all trees think we are fools. We are, mostly." "I thought I was clever for asking," he said. "I was only scared. Cleverness is the mask we put on fear to make it look handsome." "You were both," she said. "It is allowed." He put his arm around her and the baby and drew them close as if they were one person. "I feel," he said slowly, "that something is ending, the isness of winter. And what comes after will be counted in other ways." "Then we will count those ways," she said. "We will count and never stop, and when the numbers go bad we will throw them away and start again. That is all men can do. And queens. And wolves," he said, and kissed the crown of Eddard's head and the soot on Alysanne's nose and the place where Daenerys's hair had worked free of its braid. They went downstairs into a hall noisy with living. There were repairs to ask for and poems to listen to with kindness and then throw away. There were questions about whether a man should be fined for fishing with a net that took too many small ones, and whether a woman ought to be allowed to sell salt from her own door without paying the Lord's share if she had never been caught cheating. There were children darting and a cup spilled and a knife nick that bled more than it had any right to. There was the easy insolence of Arya leaning on a stool with her foot on a rung and a knife in her hand, which made the new Maester sigh and the old men grin. There was Tyrion playing 𝒖𝒏𝒊𝒕𝒆 with Bran and losing on purpose twice in a row and then winning without gloating, which is a trick neither man had learned in youth. There was Catelyn, who laughed and then pressed her hand to her ribs because sometimes laughter still hurt, in the good way. Outside, the first true melt set the air to running. The dragons let the sun stroke their necks, and when they opened their mouths to taste the new season, the heat in them smelled of feathers and meat and something like cinnamon if cinnamon had grown in ruined cities and learned to be cautious. The ravens, those heralds and scolds of the realm, sat in the mews and preened, and one turned its head and looked at Daenerys with a black bead of an eye as if to say that it would carry whatever words she had for it across any sky. She nodded as if to an equal. A realm is not saved the day a crown touches a brow or a gate swings inward. It is saved in the 1,000 days after, by someone willing to do the sums and wash the pots and pull a burned loaf from an oven without mourning it over long. They did those things. They did them well enough. They did not do them perfectly, because nothing worth doing survives perfection uncracked. And the cracks were where the light got in and men saw what sort of world they were making and whether it matched what their fathers told them they deserved. When it did, they slept easy. When it did not, they got up earlier the next day and went out to mend what could be mended and bury what could not. Years later, though not so many that Alysanne had lost her baby teeth, 2 riders came in at dusk with mud crusted to their knees and asked for bread before asking for an audience. They brought word from the fingers of the veil that a ship had come in from far east bearing rugs with dragons woven not as monsters but as mothers, and that a boy there had known a girl here in a story and had not been surprised to find out that she had a name. Daenerys sat long that night, her hand around a cup she did not drink from, thinking of the way a fire catches in a hearth when the wind is right and the wood is dry and someone has swept the ash to give it room to breathe. She thought of girls she had freed and boys who had been cut and then taught to hold a sword and men who had learned how to stop killing when they did not have to, and she let herself be pleased for a moment in a way she rarely allowed. Robb came and sat with her without asking anything because he had learned that sometimes the best question is none. The children slept heavy in their beds, their bodies doing the labor of growing without complaint. In the yard, Grey Wind dreamed and made a soft noise and Ghost did not. He did not need to. He dreamed awake. Winter had run like a deep river under the world and gone now where such waters go. Another season put its green hand on the land and pressed. They had done what they had done. There would be different work tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, until men no longer needed kings at all and queens could lay down the weight without dropping it on anyone's foot. They would not live to see that day. That was all right. They could imagine it for their children and their children's children, and get up each morning to do the part that lay, small and sharp-edged and comfortable in its place, on the table before them. Daenerys put her head on Robb's shoulder and closed her eyes, not from weariness but from peace. He laid his cheek against her hair, and together they listened to the hall settle and the wind step away from the eaves. The last log snapped in the hearth. The room cooled. The world turned, faithful as a wheel. And in the turning, the work of wolves and dragons, of winters survived and harvests planned, of oaths sworn and oaths kept, went on as it had to, as it should.